I say
One at a time.
it's the facts.
One at a time.
It's the facts. It's the facts.
Kendrick Perkins just exposed Stephen A. Smith for secretly trying to get him fired from ESPN. But that's not all. Perkins is also revealing a pattern of behavior from Stephen A. Smith that might change how people see ESPN's biggest voice. Let me break it down. The call that changed everything. There is a phone call that Kendrick Perkins says he will never forget, not because it brought good news, not because it made him rich, but because it showed him exactly who Stephen A. Smith really is when the cameras stop rolling and the lights go dark. What most people do not realize, Stephen A. Smith, the same man who sat across from Kendrick Perkins on the set of First Take day after day, smiling in his face, laughing at his jokes, pretending to be his colleague and his friend, that same man was working behind closed doors to have Perkins removed from the network entirely. And the worst part, he almost got away with it. If it were not for one conversation that Perkins had with a high-ranking ESPN executive, a conversation that was never supposed to happen, the world might never have known the truth. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand how deep this thing really goes. Because the story of Kendrick Perkins and Stephen A. Smith is not just a story about two sports commentators who did not get along. It is a story about power. It is a story about control. And more than anything, it is a story about what happens when the most influential voice in sports media decides that someone else's seat at the table needs to be taken away. Now let us rewind, because this did not start in 2026. This started years ago, back when Kendrick Perkins was just a former NBA champion trying to figure out life after basketball. Back in 2019, Perkins joined ESPN as a basketball analyst, and at first, things were fine. More than fine, actually. Perkins was hungry. He was eager. He showed up every single day ready to work, ready to prove that he belonged on television just as much as any former player who had ever made the transition from the court to the commentary desk. But there was a problem, and that problem had a name. See, when Perkins first arrived at ESPN, he was not making the kind of money you would expect from a national television personality. He was on what the industry calls a day rate contract. That meant he was earning roughly $2,500 per appearance, with a strict cap on how many days he could work each month. So while millions of viewers at home saw Kendrick Perkins sitting on that First Take set looking like a permanent fixture of the show, the reality behind the scenes was very different. He was being treated like a substitute teacher, called in when they needed him, sent home when they did not, and paid barely enough to justify the commute. Now here is where things get interesting, and here is where Stephen A. Smith enters the picture in a way that most people have never heard before. It was around 2020, maybe early 2021. The NBA playoffs were heating up, and Stephen A. Smith, who at this point was already the face of ESPN, the highest paid personality on the network, the man whose opinion could move markets and make careers, Stephen A. Smith wanted Perkins on First Take for the entire week. Not just one day, not just 2 days, the whole week. And do you know what happened when Smith made that request to the executives at ESPN? They said no. They told Stephen A. Smith, the man who would go on to sign a $100 million contract with the network, they told him that Kendrick Perkins could not appear for a full week because of his contract limitations. The day rate deal had a cap, and the bureaucracy at ESPN was not about to bend the rules, not even for their biggest star. But Stephen A. Smith did not take no for an answer. And this is the part of the story that Perkins himself shared on the Straight Game podcast, the part that for a long time made people believe that Smith was genuinely in Perkins' corner, because what Smith did next was pick up the phone, call the executives directly, and essentially demand that they fix the situation. And according to Perkins, Smith told him something that night that changed his entire career trajectory. Smith said, "You'll be hearing from the bosses tomorrow." And sure enough, the very next day, ESPN came back to Perkins with an offer that blew his mind. They did not just extend his day rate deal. They did not just add a few more appearance days. No, they tore up the old contract entirely, the one that still had a year left on it, and replaced it with a brand new 3-year deal worth approximately $700,000 per year. Just like that, overnight, Kendrick Perkins went from making $20,500 a day with no guarantees to being a full-time salaried ESPN analyst, pulling in close to $750,000 every single year. And who made that happen? Stephen A. Smith. Now, if you are hearing this for the first time, you are probably thinking the same thing most people thought when this story first came out. You are probably thinking, well, that sounds like Stephen A. Smith did Kendrick Perkins a huge favor. That sounds like a friend looking out for a friend. That sounds like the most powerful man at ESPN using his influence for good. And for a while, that is exactly what Perkins believed too. But what Perkins did not know at the time, what he says he only found out much much later is that Stephen A. Smith's motivations were not as pure as they appeared, because according to what Perkins has since revealed, that contract upgrade was not an act of friendship. It was a chess move, and Kendrick Perkins, he was the pawn. Think about it. In 2020, Stephen A. Smith was already negotiating the terms of what would become his massive deal with ESPN. He was already positioning himself as not just the face of First Take, but as the de facto creative director of the show. He wanted control over who sat across from him. He wanted to decide who challenged him on air, and more importantly, how they challenged him. And Kendrick Perkins, a big, passionate, sometimes unpolished former player who could generate reactions, but who Smith believed he could always out-debate, was the perfect foil. Smith did not get Perkins that contract because he cared about Perkins' family. He did not do it because he thought Perkins was the most talented analyst at the network. He did it because having Perkins locked into a long-term deal meant having a sparring partner he could control, someone whose entire career at ESPN was built on Stephen A. Smith's recommendation, someone who, if push ever came to shove, would owe everything to the man who made the call. And for years, that is exactly how it played out. Perkins showed up, he debated, he argued, he played his role, and Stephen A. Smith sat at the center of it all, pulling the strings like a puppet master who had built the stage himself. But then something happened that Stephen A. Smith did not expect. Kendrick Perkins stopped playing along. And when he did, when he started pushing back on Smith's narratives in ways that were a little too real and a little too personal, only this time, Stephen A. Smith was not calling the executives to help Kendrick Perkins. He was calling to get rid of him. The cracks in the empire. To understand why Stephen A. Smith eventually turned on Kendrick Perkins, you have to understand what happened between them on live television over the course of several years, because this was not a sudden break. This was a slow, grinding deterioration, a series of on-air confrontations that escalated from playful disagreements to deeply personal attacks, each one chipping away at whatever professional respect had once existed between the two men. And it started, as so many things in the NBA media world do, with a debate about race. It was February of 2023. The set of First Take. Kendrick Perkins, Stephen A. Smith, and JJ Redick, the former NBA sharpshooter who had transitioned into one of ESPN's most respected analysts, were all sitting together, discussing the NBA MVP race. And that is when Perkins dropped a take so explosive that it nearly blew the entire show apart. Perkins' argument was this: there was a racial bias embedded in MVP voting. He pointed to the numbers, citing the fact that only 3 non-top 10 seeded MVPs since 1980 had been white players, Nikola Jokic twice and Dirk Nowitzki once, and suggested that the pattern was not a coincidence. It was a bold claim. It was a controversial claim, and whether you agreed with it or not, it was the kind of statement that makes producers in the control room simultaneously terrified and thrilled, because they know the internet is about to explode, and explode it did, but not in the way Perkins expected, because sitting right next to him was JJ Redick, and Redick was not having it, not even a little bit. In fact, what happened next became one of the most talked about moments in the history of First Take.
It really is. But what we've just witnessed is the problem with this show, where we create narratives that do not exist in reality.
And Redick was just getting started, because this was not just a disagreement about statistics. This was a man who felt that his colleague had just implied something deeply offensive about an entire group of people: the voters, the media members, the basketball community at large.
The implication, what you are implying, that the white voters that vote on NBA are racist, that they favor white people.
The tension on the set was so thick, you could have cut it with a knife. Redick's voice was shaking, not from fear, from fury. And Perkins, to his credit, did not back down. He tried to hold his ground.
You just said that. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. That is exactly what you implied, Kendrick Perkins. That is exactly what you implied.
Notice that. Redick was so heated that he called him Spencer Perkins instead of Kendrick. That is how you know a debate has gone past the point of professional discourse and into something personal. And Perkins, feeling the walls closing in, did what any competitor would do: he fought back.
Secondly, hold on.
I did not call. I stated the facts. And you're not about to sit up.
We all know what you implied.
The aftermath of that segment was nuclear. Social media was on fire. Reddit threads were exploding. And in the middle of it all, do you know what Stephen A. Smith was doing? According to multiple accounts, he was sitting there, quiet as a mouse, letting Perkins and Redick tear each other apart while he watched from the sidelines like a spectator at a boxing match. Now, publicly, Smith eventually addressed the incident. He went on the Bill Simmons podcast and admitted that things had gotten out of hand. He said it got uncomfortable. uncomfortable. His exact words were, first of all, it can go too far. Secondly, in that particular show, it did go too far. I thought both of them were wrong to a certain degree. It did get uncomfortable. But here's the thing that Perkins says bothered him the most about that situation. It was not that the debate got heated. Perkins has been in heated situations his entire life. He played in the NBA for over a decade. He won a championship with the Boston Celtics. He went to war in playoff games against the toughest players on the planet. A loud argument on a television set was not going to rattle him. What bothered Perkins was what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Because according to Perkins, Stephen A. Smith did not pull him aside after the show and say, "Hey, that got crazy, but I've got your back." He did not call him that night and check on him. Instead, what Smith did was go behind the scenes and use that very incident, the JJ Redick blowup, as evidence that Perkins was a liability, a loose cannon, someone who could not be trusted on live television without creating a public relations disaster for the network. And this was not the only time Smith allegedly used an on-air moment against Perkins behind closed doors, because the clashes kept coming, and each time the pattern was the same. Perkins and Smith would go at it on camera, sometimes about LeBron versus Jordan, sometimes about MVP picks, sometimes about whether the Eastern Conference or the Western Conference was getting the respect it deserved. And then, when the segment was over, Smith would go to the executives and paint Perkins as the problem. Take the Christmas Day schedule debate in August of 2025. The NBA had just released its holiday lineup, and it was stacked with Western Conference matchups. 4 out of 5 games featured West teams, with only the Cleveland Cavaliers versus New York Knicks representing the East. Stephen A. Smith called it disrespectful to the Eastern Conference. And Perkins went on the Road Trippin' podcast and dismantled Smith's argument piece by piece. Perkins' position was simple, and it was loud. He said the Western Conference had all the star power: Anthony Edwards, Nikola Jokic, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, LeBron James, Stephen Curry, Kevin Durant, Cooper Flagg, and that the NBA was making a smart business decision by putting its biggest names on the biggest stage, especially since basketball was competing directly with the NFL for viewers on Christmas Day. And Perkins did not mince words. He said, "This league still belongs to the OGs. KD, Steph, Bron. Guess who's playing on the opening night of the NBA? KD, Steph, Bron, and the champs, because it's ring night. Guess who's playing on Christmas? KD, Steph, Bron." He went even further, breaking down the competitive landscape with a level of detail that made Smith's argument look shallow by comparison. They have 2 sports that are playing on Christmas Day. You have football, which is king. Okay, we get that. But you also have basketball. And in order to get the eyeballs you need, where are your biggest superstars in the game of basketball? They're in the Western Conference. Now, on the surface, this was just 2 analysts disagreeing about a schedule. Normal stuff. The kind of thing that happens every day in sports media. But beneath the surface, Perkins says this was another moment that Smith weaponized against him, because according to Perkins, Smith did not appreciate being publicly contradicted, especially not by someone whose career at ESPN existed because of a phone call that Smith himself had made years earlier. And this brings us to what might be the most telling incident of them all, the one that involves Stephen A. Smith going on one of his signature rants. Not about basketball, not about a player, not about a team, but about Kendrick Perkins himself. The clip went viral. Smith, visibly agitated, sat on the set of First Take and laid into Perkins in a way that felt personal, not professional.
From a basketball standpoint, I'm not disagreeing with Perk per se, but he's really annoying me today. And I'm going to tell you why Perkins is annoying me.
And notice what Smith said there. He was not disagreeing with Perkins' basketball analysis. He was not saying Perkins was wrong about the facts. He was saying Perkins was annoying him. This was not about basketball anymore. This was personal. Smith continued, his voice rising with every sentence.
Because this is a man that is a champion. You're talking about a Game 7, and he's talking about a Game 7 like, you know what? Hey, Cat's just gonna step up.
And then Smith went for the jugular. He brought up the one moment in Perkins' career that every NBA fan knows about, the injury that kept him out of the biggest game of his life.
And he knows this because he's a champion, and not only that, when they lost in Game 7, you were injured, you didn't play.
That right there. That is the moment that Perkins says crossed the line, because bringing up his 2010 NBA Finals injury, the knee injury that kept him from playing in Game 7 against the Lakers, a game the Celtics lost, a loss that haunts Perkins to this day, that was not analysis. That was not debate. That was a knife, and Stephen A. Smith twisted it on national television.
Had you played, you might have beat the Lakers. It's a big deal. It's a game Game 7.
The implication was clear. Smith was saying, you are not qualified to talk about Game 7 pressure because you were not even on the court for the biggest Game 7 of your career. And while Malika Andrews tried to step in and mediate,
Can I defend your honor here? I don't think we got time. Just because you yell something doesn't mean it's true.
the damage was already done. The internet had its clip. The narrative was set. And behind the scenes, according to Perkins, Stephen A. Smith was using moments exactly like this one to build a case with ESPN executives that Kendrick Perkins was more trouble than he was worth. But the Charles Barkley situation in March of 2025 might be the clearest example of the double standard that Perkins says existed at ESPN. When Barkley went on TNT's Inside the NBA and called Perkins an idiot and a fool for his Lakers coverage, Perkins fired back on X with characteristic intensity, challenging Barkley to say it to his face. And Stephen A. Smith, at the time, he actually defended Perkins publicly, posting on X, "Yo Chuck, stop the BS with the y'all. Attach a name to it. Sounds supportive, right? Sounds like a colleague having your back." But Perkins says that behind closed doors, the story was completely different. While Smith was playing the role of the loyal teammate in public, Perkins claimed Smith was simultaneously telling ESPN brass that the Barkley feud was yet another example of why Perkins was a PR risk for the network. The argument, according to Perkins, was simple. This guy starts fights everywhere he goes, on our set, on podcasts, on social media, with other networks' talent. How long before he becomes a bigger headache than he is worth? And the cruelest irony of all, by the time Perkins and Barkley squashed their beef in June 2025, thanks to Michael Wilbon mediating a conversation, with Barkley even suggesting they link up and break bread during the NBA Finals, the damage at ESPN had already been done. The seeds that Smith had planted with the executives had already taken root, and Perkins was about to find out just how deep those roots went, because there was one more incident, one more public blowup that, according to Perkins, gave Stephen A. Smith the final piece of ammunition he needed, and it involved something that had nothing to do with basketball. It involved a gaming app called Papaya Gaming. In November of 2025, ESPN reportedly ordered its on-air talent, including Perkins, to cut ties with the controversial gaming app. The network deemed it a conflict of interest and demanded compliance. But here's the part that made Perkins' blood boil. Stephen A. Smith had also promoted the app, and yet, according to reports, Smith faced no similar repercussions. No public scolding, no forced separation, nothing. The message, Perkins says, could not have been clearer. There was one set of rules for Stephen A. Smith, and there was another set of rules for everyone else. And if you were Kendrick Perkins, if you were the man whose entire ESPN career was built on Stephen A. Smith's recommendation, then stepping out of line meant risking everything. The reckoning. By February of 2026, the writing was on the wall, and Kendrick Perkins could read every single word. The rumors had been swirling for weeks. YouTube videos with sensational titles were popping up left and right, claiming that Perkins had been officially fired from ESPN after a new fight with Stephen A. Smith. Parody accounts on X were churning out fake breaking news posts, mimicking the style of real reporters like Shams Charania and Adrian Wojnarowski to make the rumors seem legitimate. And on Reddit, in the NBA forums, in the comment sections of every sports blog from coast to coast, fans were debating whether Perkins' time at ESPN was finally over. The noise was deafening, and for the first time in his career, Perkins felt like he was losing control of the narrative. But here is the thing about Kendrick Perkins that people tend to forget. This is a man who grew up in Beaumont, Texas, the 409 as he calls it, where you learn early in life that you do not run from a fight, you run toward it. And that is exactly what Perkins decided to do. He went on air, he looked directly into the camera, and with the kind of calm confidence that only comes from a man who has already made peace with whatever happens next, Kendrick Perkins said the words that sent shockwaves through the entire sports media industry. "If ESPN fired me today, I would lose no sleep. You know why? Because somebody in Boston would hire me." The statement went viral within minutes, and it was not just the words themselves that hit so hard, it was what they represented. Because Perkins was not just talking about job security. He was not just flexing his connections in Boston, the city where he won a championship, the city that loved him like one of its own. No, Perkins was sending a message, and that message was directed at one person and one person only, Stephen A. Smith. What Perkins was really saying, in the language that only people who have lived through corporate backstabbing can truly understand, was this: you do not own me. You think you built my career? You think that phone call you made back in 2020 gives you the right to decide when my career at ESPN ends? You think wrong, because I was somebody before you, and I will be somebody after you. And if this network decides to let me go because you pulled strings behind the scenes, then I will walk out of this building with my head held high and my phone ringing off the hook. And the reaction on social media was electric. Some people mocked him. Some people applauded him. Some fans listed him among the NBA morons who should have been fired long ago. But what nobody could deny, not the haters, not the skeptics, not even Stephen A. Smith himself, was that Kendrick Perkins had just done something that almost nobody at ESPN has the courage to do. He told the truth. And the truth, as Perkins laid it out over the following days and weeks, was damning, because Perkins did not just fire off one defiant statement and then go silent. He kept talking on podcasts, on social media, in interviews, and piece by piece, he began to pull back the curtain on what he described as a pattern of manipulation, favoritism, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering that he says defined Stephen A. Smith's approach to power at ESPN. Perkins talked about how Smith used his influence to control not just WHO appeared on First Take, but what they were allowed to say. He talked about how Smith would privately criticize colleagues to executives while publicly pretending to support them. He talked about the Papaya Gaming double standard, how he and other talent were forced to sever ties with the app while Smith faced no consequences for doing the exact same thing. And he talked about how, in the end, the very contract that Smith had helped him secure back in 2020 had become a leash, not a lifeline. The response from ESPN was, predictably, silence. The network did not issue a statement. They did not confirm or deny Perkins' allegations. They simply let the news cycle churn, hoping that the next big story would push this one to the back page. But what ESPN could not control was the public record, because the evidence of the Smith-Perkins dynamic was all out there, scattered across years of on-air exchanges, social media posts, and podcast appearances. And when you put it all together, when you line up the timeline of their public interactions against the timeline of the private maneuvering that Perkins described, a picture begins to emerge that is deeply unsettling. In 2020, Smith helped Perkins get a $700,000 a year contract. In 2023, Smith sat by while Perkins and JJ Redick nearly came to blows over a race debate, then used the incident as ammunition behind the scenes. In 2025, Smith publicly defended Perkins during the Barkley feud, while privately, according to Perkins, painting him as a liability to ESPN executives. And by February 2026, the wheels were in motion. The pattern, as Perkins describes it, is textbook. Build someone up just enough that they depend on you. Then, when they stop being useful, when they start thinking for themselves, when they start challenging you in ways that you did not authorize, tear them down. Not publicly, never publicly. That would make you look bad. No, you do it quietly. You do it in meetings. You do it with whispers and suggestions, and carefully place doubts in the ears of the people who sign the checks. And the saddest part of this whole story, it almost worked. Because by mid-February 2026, the rumors had reached a fever pitch. Fans were convinced Perkins was gone. Media outlets were running headlines about his ESPN exit drama. And Stephen A. Smith, according to Perkins, was sitting back and watching it all unfold with a smile on his face, even appearing to mock Perkins on air after the exit drama exploded, treating the whole thing like entertainment rather than a man's livelihood. But here is what Stephen A. Smith did not count on. He did not count on ESPN's official press room still listing Perkins as an active NBA analyst. He did not count on Perkins being named to the revamped NBA countdown team alongside Malika Andrews, Brian Windhorst, and Michael Malone. And he did not count on the fact that the same executives he had been whispering to had apparently decided that Kendrick Perkins was worth keeping around, not because of Stephen A. Smith, but in spite of him. And this is where the story takes its most ironic twist, because while Stephen A. Smith was allegedly working behind the scenes to push Perkins out, Smith himself had voluntarily stepped back from NBA Countdown during his own contract negotiations. He even said publicly that he didn't want to be on the show, citing his busy schedule. So while Smith was supposedly trying to get Perkins removed from the network, he was the one who actually left the show. And Perkins was the one who stayed. You cannot write irony better than that. But perhaps the most powerful thing that Kendrick Perkins did in the middle of all this chaos was not the viral quote. It was not the podcast revelations. It was not the social media posts or the on-air defiance. The most powerful thing Perkins did was refuse to become what Stephen A. Smith wanted him to be, a cautionary tale. Because in the world of sports media, there are countless stories of analysts and commentators who got chewed up and spit out by the machine, people who made enemies with the wrong person, who crossed the wrong line, who dared to have an opinion that did not align with the most powerful voice in the room. And most of those people disappear. They fade away. They get replaced by the next hot take artist, the next former player willing to sit in a chair and nod along with whatever Stephen A. Smith says. Kendrick Perkins refused to be that person. He stood his ground. He told his side of the story, and he forced the conversation that ESPN had been trying to avoid for years. A conversation about power, about favoritism, about what happens when one personality at a network becomes so influential that they can make or break careers with a single phone call. The same phone call that gave Perkins his $700,000 contract could have, in theory, taken it away. And that, more than anything, is what Perkins says scared him the most. Not losing the money, not losing the platform, but the realization that his entire career at ESPN had been built on a foundation controlled by someone who never truly had his best interests at heart. As of right now, Kendrick Perkins remains an ESPN analyst. His bio is still active on the ESPN press room website. Reports of his firing have been debunked, despite the frenzy of clickbait and parody accounts that tried to make it seem like a done deal. And Stephen A. Smith, he is still the most powerful voice at ESPN, still the highest paid personality on the network, still the man whose opinion can move markets and shape narratives. But something has shifted, something fundamental, because now the audience knows, now the fans know, now the people who tune in every morning to watch First Take know that what they are seeing on camera might not match what is happening behind the scenes. And that knowledge, that awareness, is something that Stephen A. Smith cannot spin, cannot debate, and cannot yell his way out of. Kendrick Perkins did not just survive Stephen A. Smith's alleged campaign against him, he exposed it. And in doing so, he showed the world something that the sports media industry has been trying to hide for a very long time. That the biggest battles in sports television are not fought on the court or in the ring. They are fought in boardrooms, in executive suites, in private phone calls between powerful men who decide other people's futures over lunch. And the next time you watch Kendrick Perkins and Stephen A. Smith sit across from each other on live television, arguing about LeBron or the MVP race or the Christmas Day schedule, ask yourself this question: is this real, or is this just another performance in a game that was rigged long before the cameras ever started rolling? Because Kendrick Perkins already knows the answer, and now, so do you. If you enjoyed watching this video, check out our other awesome videos on the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.